Welcome to the Restore Church podcast. We hope you enjoyed this week's message from Pastor Mark. For more information, please visit restoreportsmouth.com.
We should be believers who view culture through scriptural eyes. We know what the truth is, and we believe the truth will set us free. We also know that culture can't make up its mind about what truth even is. Every 50 to 100 years, we change our mind about what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true, what is worth following, what is not worth following, who is worth following, who is not worth following, who is worth being venerized or symbolized or idolized or, following, and who isn't. So in this passage, we're going to see that Paul doesn't just appease culture and say one thing, and on the flip side, he doesn't seek to irritate culture either by saying another. Instead, he says what these people know to be true and what they know will be culturally unpopular in their context, which is actually the reverse of our context, by the way. Paul was writing to a group of people who had a very different view of the home than you and I do. We live in a very egalitarian world. Everyone is equal, including kids. We have kids who tell their parents what to do these days. We live in a wild world. What Paul wants them to know is it's one thing to talk about new living. It's another thing to take living home. It's another thing to take new lifestyle home. And Paul doesn't want this church in Colossae to be another church that talks about new living, but when they get home, they live and operate just like everyone else around them. There's no actual change in the way they treat their husbands, their wives, their children, their neighbors, even their bondservants. So pick up with me in chapter 3 and verse 18. And I want you to notice the first word, wives. You know, Paul didn't start with the husbands in this passage. Already, he is going against the cultural grain. See, we live in a world where we believe in equals. They did not. In the world in which they lived, a Greco-Roman culture, the husband had absolute control over the home. And so often the husbands were addressed first. It was always their decision. And by the way, they had life or death decision-making abilities. In other words, if a Greco-Roman culture, in that culture, a husband decided he didn't want those kids anymore, they were considered property and they were his to do with whatever he wanted, including killing them. The same applied to his wife. Paul does not buy into that cultural kind of thinking at all. And so already you can see he doesn't line up with their thinking. And so he doesn't start with the husband in this passage. In other passages he does. And we're going to note that he writes in other passages this same idea, but he starts with the husbands. He's making clear indicators here that there's truth, but there's what the culture he preaches. He wants to make 6 things clear to every single person in the room. 6 things that submission is not. Submission is not agreeing on everything. When you hear that statement, wives, and by the way, this applies to wives, not women. You'll notice Paul did not say, women, be subject to all men. What a crazy world that would live in. The passage here is for husbands and wives and children and then bondservants. Why? Because those are all contained inside the home. Often these bondservants would live with the family members. Paul writes to these wives and he mentions this word submission, and we need to know that submission doesn't mean we always agree on everything. Good leadership, husband, often means that you're going to say, hey, you were right, I was wrong. Number 2, submission does not mean leaving your brain at the altar. These are John Piper's ideas. I don't want to take credit for this. But he says, submission does not mean you have no thought process. You have no weight in the matter. As a matter of fact, you should be involved. John puts it this way. He says, the question becomes, who says let's more often? I was reading a post this week, and it's a guy I put on Facebook. He said, whenever my wife says, I've been thinking, let's fill in the blank, he knows it's either going to cost him money, he's going to have a project he needs to do, or it's going to be something he doesn't want to do. And John Piper puts it this way, who is saying let's more often than the other? He says if it's your wife saying, let's get our budget in order, if it's the wife saying, let's get to church on time this week, hey, if it's your wife saying, let's get spiritual, if it's your wife saying, let's try to do better with the kids, he says there's a problem, and the problem isn't your wife, it's you. You should be the husband who leads and says, hey, let's get back in church. Hey, let's begin doing some things we know we need to do. Hey, let's get our budget in order. I promise you guys, when we lead like we should, it will relieve pressure on our wives to feel like they always need to remind us of things, because we will actually be the active leader we should be in saying, hey, let's make sure God is a priority in our lives. Let's make sure that these things take place. Let's make sure that we're not missing anything. Submission does not mean that you do not have a thought process in the matter. Number 3, submission does not mean that you don't try to influence or change your husband. You will find in 1 Peter, when Peter's writing to a woman, to a couple of ladies actually in the church where they were saved and their husband wasn't. He actually says what you should try to do is live a godly life and influence him for Christ. You shouldn't just say, well, I'm submitting if he doesn't want to follow Jesus. No, you should do your best to influence him to do what's right. You should do your best to influence him in a way that honors God. So it doesn't mean that wives shouldn't influence or even try to change their husband. And every husband said, my wife's been trying to change me for a long time, Pastor Mark. And you know what? In a lot of ways, she's probably right. She's probably correct in some ways that you and I need to change. Number 4, submission is not putting the will of the husband before the will of Christ. When a man asks his wife to do anything that goes against the will of God, that breaks the laws of God. Again, I'll reference 1 Peter. He was writing to a woman whose husband wasn't saved. Can you imagine if that husband said to that woman, hey, come with me. We're going to go worship Dagon, the god of our area, and you're going to worship him with me. She would have to humbly say, no, I cannot do that. She would still be submitting in that area, but she'd say, no, I can't do that. I can't submit to your God, to your faith. I have to say, no, that's too far. I submit to God. I submit to you, but I submit to God first. Number 5, submission does not mean getting all of her spiritual strength through her husband. This does not mean that your wife depends on you spiritually. Because I'm going to tell you what, I know a lot of Christian ladies, it's a good thing they don't rely on their husband for spiritual wisdom all the time, for spiritual strength, for spiritual growth. Because let's be honest, guys, a lot of us drop the ball in that area. We may be the head of the home, but that does not mean that we are the only one they're capable of relying on. And then number 6, submission does not mean living or acting in fear. This passage we're about to read, and we've already read once, I'm going to read it again, is not a passage that should be used to demean, belittle, or use your wife. Or my wife. We are to love and honor and cherish our wives. And the problem that most of us bring to this passage is we have the wrong kind of thinking when we read this verse, this passage. And what we're actually doing is we're taking ideas that someone else has misused this passage to convey or say to someone, and we're assuming that that's what that passage means. This word submit is a willing submission. This is contradictory to the culture of their day. Do you know what was considered the culture of their day? There was no question in the matter. Later, he's going to say, children, obey your parents. The culture said, children and wives, obey your husband. Paul does not say, wives, obey your husband. He knows that that is a line too far, and that does not honor the wife as what she has been created to be in this relationship, the marriage, the home. Submission is a calling of a wife to honor and affirm her husband's leadership and to help carry it through according to her gifts. Now, I want you to notice the little phrase. We'll read it again. Verse 18, he says, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. He puts this little disclaimer. God, by submitting to your husband, and don't dishonor your husband in the way that you submit to him. And he doesn't leave the wives alone. He goes right to the husbands. He says, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. I want to remind you, he has no legal standing here. If a man walked up to another man in Colossae or any Greco-Roman culture and tried to tell him how to treat his wife, that was grounds for real issues. There could be fist fights. But Paul says, I'm not coming to you as a Roman citizen. I'm coming to you as a brother in Christ. And what the world says is okay, we say some of that's not okay. And what the world says is best, we say, no, this is what is best. And so the world is flipped upside down now, of course. 2,000 years later, we look at passages like this and we say, husbands, yeah, you should love your wives, but wives, you don't have to submit. You shouldn't do this. And we miss the whole point that the word submission there in the Greek is a willingness. And by the way, husbands, if you think that the problem with verse 18 is that your wife isn't doing it, I'll say the problem is probably that you're not doing what you're supposed to in verse 19. Most of us are willing to submit to one another in a loving and generous way when there's real trust, real honor, and real love. You know that in other passages, the writer says, hey, submit to one another. We know that. And I'm not going to water down this passage by saying, well, really, we all submit. We do all submit. But I want you to understand, if someone isn't submitting, it's often because we're not creating and all responsibility. And you ought to do and I ought to do what we should and what we can to be the responsible men in the relationship. But he doesn't just focus on the husband and the wife. He says in verse 20, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. This is a reminder of Old Testament teaching, which they knew. They knew it by heart. Some of them who grew up in Hebrew tradition, they knew this. But the word children here is not just children under the age of 18. In their society, it was very common, just like our society, for people past the age of 18 to live at home. In the Hebrew tradition, most of you know in the patriarchy, when you were actually married, sometimes you still lived in the main tent and they would like sew on a bigger tent. And so there was multiple wives and children kids with their wives, multiple daughters with their husbands living under this one tent. And there was this big, huge family. And the dad at the top, man, you still obeyed him when you were in his home. And I believe there's a lot of good truth there. If you're going to live with your parents past 18, yeah, you can vote. Yeah, you could go buy cigarettes. But if you're living in their house, you probably need to respect and honor their rules. Look, when I go into Walmart, whatever their rules are, that's their rules. They own the store. I'm going to abide. When I'm in someone else's home, it is my job to be respectful. And so this passage is more than just your 10-year-old. This goes so far as to say, hey, if you're living at home with your parents, you should seek to obey them. Now look, it gets different when you turn 25 and you move out of the house, but honoring our father and our mother never goes away. You may be here tonight and you have a parent or two parents who do not know the Lord, who disrespect you, who are not kind or not generous. We should honor our parents the best we can. Whether they are angry, always want to fight, we can honor our parents, whether they're Christian or not, in a way that draws people to Christ. And I want you to get this whole point of this passage. What Paul is describing here is more than just a church religion, it's a home religion. It's a religion and a faith that you take home with you. And so in verse 21, he goes back to the dads. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. This is actually strong. This is the way that, this is the ESV we're reading together here in the NKJV, give me a second to get there, it puts it this way. It says, fathers, don't provoke your children lest they become, I'm in the same book. I'm sorry. I'm all over the place. Oh, this is one where they agree. The Greek here is stronger, and I thought it was conveyed in the NKJV. I know it is in the KJV. The Greek here really indicates that there are dads running their kids crazy to the point these kids don't even want to be around them. These kids don't want to be alive. They would rather be dead than deal with their parents. And so fathers, don't provoke your children is the idea of pushing them too far, aggravating them in such a way that you know you are not just punishing and discipling and disciplining them, you are making life difficult for them, either because you're jealous of something they have, you're frustrated at what they haven't become, or you're trying to live your life through them. And he says, don't do that. And then in verse 22, I want you to read it with me. It says, slaves, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters. What? I want to remind you that the New Testament makes clear that the kind of slavery our country has outlawed is awful, it's wicked. And it's not just true of the New Testament. The Old Testament makes clear, God tells his people, you do not kidnap people and force them into slavery. It's wrong, it's evil, it's wicked. Now, other cultures around the Hebrews would do it, and sometimes God would even use the Hebrews to inflict judgment upon those people for that. But God made clear it was wrong then, and it's wrong in the New Testament, and it's wrong now. But what we tend to do is we tend to say, well, we're right on this subject. Why isn't Paul addressing it the way that we think he should? A couple things. Paul starts out by addressing slaves. Do you want to know why? Because he knows the congregation is predominantly slaves at this point in this church. It may also be why he addressed the women first, because most congregations were predominantly female, just like today. And so Paul knows that most of the people listening to him are actually slaves. Now, your Bible may say bondservant, and I want to draw a distinction. Not every slave who read this was like we picture a slave in American colonialism or American 17th or 18th century. Most of these slaves were not kidnapped, tortured, and abused, but some may have been. Most of them were what was called a bondservant. And a bondservant was someone who entered into a debt for a master, and they were not treated like we think of in the 17th, 18th century of American culture. By the way, I just want to make this clear. We tend to think that because slavery was outlawed here, it's a finished subject. You do understand that there is slavery going on right now in 2021. And so as much as we would like to think that we fixed it because it's not a problem here, I want to remind you, we were late to the game. England had already outlawed it a few decades before, thanks to the abolitionist movement of people like William Wilberforce, good men who came a long way. So you ask yourself, wait a minute, Paul, wait a minute. Why don't you act like William Wilberforce in this passage? I'm going to tell you why. Paul knows that he could easily with the stroke of a pen, say, slaves, you are not bound, create an uprising, go fight. And he knows what'll happen. At this point, there are a few thousand Christians. You know what'll happen? They'll all get killed. There will be blood in the streets, and the blood will be on his hands. And so Paul knows the best way to fight against this injustice is to do what he does in the letter of Philemon. Paul writes to Philemon, who is a slave owner. His bondservant has run away. Onesimus has run away to Paul. And Paul has convinced Onesimus to return to Philemon. And here's what he says. I'm going to give this letter to you, and you're going to take it to your master, your bondservant master, Philemon. And I'm going to write him a letter, and I'm going to appeal to him on Christian charity. And here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say, Philemon, Onesimus has run away. He knows he's made a mistake. He is coming to you in good faith because I've told him that you are a Christian man and you will not only receive him back, you will treat him like a Christian brother. And on top of that, you will make him an heir. Paul uses language of brother and son in God. And what he's making clear is that sometimes when a Roman citizen like Philemon owned a slave and they didn't have children of their own, they could make their slave their heir and pass on all of their monetary wealth, all of their physical wealth, everything they owned to that slave. And that slave would not only be freed, he would now be powerful. And so Paul appeals to Philemon and says, Philemon, he's coming back and he's apologizing. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to know that you have legal rights in this matter, but as a Christian, I am trusting that you're going to do the right thing. And Paul knows that he cannot create an uprising against the Roman government. As a matter of fact, Paul's writing from prison because the Roman government wants to kill him. So Paul knows if we can create enough truth, if we can write down what is right, we give this thing enough time, the church will rise up and hopefully we will correct this wrong. And certainly the church was instrumental in correcting that wrong. It didn't happen as quickly as we would like, but Paul is doing his best here to protect these people from certain death. Paul also doesn't tell Onesimus when he runs away from Philemon, hey, Onesimus, you're free, just go do what you want, because that is also dangerous. If someone were found roaming the streets who you knew to formerly be a slave or a bondservant, and they could not prove that they had been freed, you could not only kill them, you could take them into bondage, and poor Onesimus could end up in a worse situation than he was with Philemon. So Paul's point is never to just say, we should do this and we'll burn the whole place to the ground. He wants to subtly go against the culture, just like he started with wives instead of husbands. He's subtly addressing what is wrong while preaching what is right. And so here he says, slaves, bondservants, he says, I want you to hear me. I know that you're trusting the Lord. He says, listen, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart. You sense in this passage already, this is not the same level of servanthood or slavery that we picture. There was no room in slavery like we picture for anybody to just be eye service working. You know what I'm saying? They would have been beaten and whipped. He says, I know the situation you're in is grave, but it's probably not as bad as what we may be picturing. Not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Most of these bondservants lived in a safe home where they were either one of a handful or the only servant in this home. And so they knew the children, they knew the master, they knew the wife, they knew everybody. And the whole understanding and context of this passage is Paul wants the home to be a place with love, order, and Christian honor. Verse 23, but whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. He says, guys, whether or not you ever receive what you are due here, do it for the Lord. By the way, could we just insert this here? Most of us have worked a job where nobody cared how hard we worked. Most of us have been in a season of life where no matter what we did, we were not given the respect, maybe the pay, maybe the ovation, whatever it was that we deserved. Someone else took credit. Someone else didn't give us what we were due. But these are seasons when we honor God with our work. Verse 24, knowing from the Lord, you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. He says, guys, we live in an unjust world, but heaven is just. Verse 25, for the wrongdoer, he says, those of you who have a wrongdoing master, the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done. And there's no partiality. He says, look, I know that right now when you try to report your master because he's a Roman citizen, no one hears you. God does not care whether or not your owner, your master is a Roman citizen, is wealthy or weak. He will dole out justice as is right. And then at the end, he addresses masters. And here's why. This lengthy passage, why is he knocking on this? Because he knows the majority of the congregation are bondservants. Verse 1, he says to the masters of chapter 4, treat your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. He says, I know you have found yourself in a position here on earth where you can abuse some rules from time to time. But know this, that is not how heaven operates. That is not how God operates. You need to do what's right. I would remind you of the teaching that Jesus even said. He said, how rare it is for the wealthy to enter into the kingdom of the Lord. And the disciples said, does this mean anybody who's rich, nobody could get saved who's rich? He said, no. With man, it seems impossible, but with God, all things are possible. But he just said, it's rare. It's rare. In a lot of ways, you and I like to identify with the bondservants. We like to picture ourselves as lowly, humble, abused, forgotten, and certainly you may have lived through a season like that in your life. But as I am always reminded, most of us in American culture are far more free, far more wealthy, far more safe, protected, and valued than any of the bondservants we've just read about. And so before we go just saying, well, I need to work harder and no one loves me, we might need to read verse 1 of chapter 4 for ourselves. And be reminded that we are called to treat people with honor and respect, whether they're my waitress at the table, whether they're the person that cleans up the trash when I'm finished, whether they are someone who I don't have to address, who doesn't have the same status, standing, whether they are 3 levels below me in employment, whether they have 3 direct reports before they ever speak to me, I am to treat all people with respect as image bearers. And so Paul, in this passage, in the book of Romans, in his letter to Philemon, he blunts this issue of slavery, which I will say, guys, I want to make very clear. Slavery is always wrong, but this was far more an issue of bondservanthood, which more than often was entered into willingly. It's kind of like a debt, kind of like, all right, when we buy a house, we enter into a debt with the bank. It's called a mortgage, right? Now, the truth is, if you have a mortgage tonight, you can get out of it if you want. The bank doesn't want you to, but like you could go through a foreclosure process. You could walk away from the loan. Bondservanthood is a debt that you can't walk away from. Bondservanthood would be I come to somebody and say, hey, I need this cash to pay off a debt that maybe my father's had, maybe to buy a house, whatever it is, but I'm gonna make myself the collateral. And I'm gonna attach myself to you. And until this debt is paid, I'm gonna be your servant. You need me to work the fields? I'll work the fields. You need me to oversee other servants? I'll oversee other servants. And the amount of money I would get was dependent on my knowledge and skills. If I had experience running a big household with multiple servants, well, then I could probably get a pretty good debt service, and I'd have to be responsible for multiple other bondservants or servants or household employees. If I wasn't very knowledgeable, wasn't very skilled, I might have to attach myself to a not as wealthy landowner who only had a small household, and I was basically watching his kids, keeping an eye on the few animals that he had, and doing my best to keep a good record on the books. Whatever it looked like, more often than not, the people that Paul was writing to entered into it willingly. Now, there were certainly slaves who were bought, who were kidnapped when the Roman government would overtake an area. And the New Testament and the Old Testament make clear for God's people, the Israelites in the Old Testament, and for Christians in the New Testament, this is wrong, this is wicked, and this is something that we stand against. But when Paul wrote this letter, to create an uprising would have wiped them out. And so Paul does what is wise, and he plays the long game, and he says, this is what's right. Stand for truth. preach the gospel. And here's what we all know to be true. Too many Christians today buy into this same type of thinking. Well, the Apostle Paul, he's just a coward. He should have taken on the Roman government. He shouldn't be so concerned with our individual lives. He should take on the political arena. He should take on the rulers of his day. Paul did. He gave his life for it. But not in defense of an ideology or a political way of thinking. Paul gave his life in defense of the gospel. And even until his dying day, he was witnessing to soldiers who were chained to him. Paul knew that the greatest way for us to affect change in the world was for us to live Christian lives that honor the Lord. And so I would put it this way. Does my home, whether it's my home that I am the husband or a single man, a wife or a single woman, husband where I'm a stay-at-home mom or a mom with a job, whether I am staying home with my parents, I am in my 20s, but I'm living with mom and dad, or I am out on my own for the first time in my life, does my home honor God in such a way that my neighbor would want to follow Jesus? What Paul knows is it's one thing to preach the gospel, it's another thing to live the gospel. And he knows that if these bondservants, these children, these husbands, these wives would live the gospel out in a day-to-day basis, it would not only affect change in their neighborhood, it would ultimately lead to a change that would revolutionize the world. And as powerful and as strong and as bold as Rome seemed at the moment with their large armies and their cultural influence and the wicked way that they said anything goes, any form of sexual perversion was allowed, as powerful as they seemed, Paul knew that radically changed lives over the course of a generation or two would lead to life change that could not be ignored. And as a matter of fact, it did. And within 1 or 2 generations, you have Roman emperors realizing the Christian group here now outnumbers the true worshipers of Caesar. And so we need to marry ourselves to God. Paul could have married God to politics, could have married God to Rome early on, but he refused to. He could have taken Rome on headstrong like the Hebrews and said, we will not hear your nonsense. And he would have been wiped out just like Jerusalem was in AD 70, 72 when they come in and they destroy the place. Just wipe it out. Only a handful of people survive. But Paul knows the greatest way to affect change in the world is a gospel-changed life. And before too long, Rome's watering down its cultural influence. It tries to marry itself to God. It tries to force people to become Christians. Things don't work out. It just becomes a big mess. And then the Catholic Church gets involved. The power and the money and the political power begin to mix in the same bowl. And all along the way, the gospel continues to grow. In spite of the Roman oppression, and then even in spite of the Roman watering down. When the Roman ruler said, hey, you need to become a Christian to be a Roman citizen, all of a sudden the churches are filled with nominal Christians. And you think, oh no, the gospel's lost its influence. No, by then it's already reaching India. By then it's already past Northern Africa, it's in Central Africa. Most of the early church fathers who wrote, guys like Augustine, they didn't come from Europe, they didn't come from the Middle East. Most of them came from Central Africa. The gospel spread rapidly around the known world because Paul wanted them to see, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to live it. And so my encouragement when we deal with passages like this is very simple. You need to understand that we are not the smartest generation that's ever been born. It's very easy for us to look down our nose at a generation 3 generations ago and say, we know so much more now. I want you to understand that every generation has made mistakes and we will continue to make mistakes. And as I mentioned before, slavery still exists. We're fooling ourselves if we think that before Jesus returns, we're gonna fix this world. No, but we can fix our home. And when we fix our home, we can influence the neighborhood. And I believe we can create little pockets of the kingdom of Jesus where we do affect change. And I know that I've mentioned to you a couple of times over the last few weeks that it has been a hard year for our city. We have a lot of structural issues, societal issues, political issues. We have great divides in our city. But listen to me. We have mayor, city council, police department, fire department, city groups, city-sponsored groups, nonprofit groups, grassroots efforts, federally funded groups. When the church does what it should, we should not only relieve pressure on these other groups, they should almost begin to say, what just took place? We've hired some more police officers, but crime is way too down. What's going on? This makes no sense. these grassroots efforts who are trying to their best to support single moms and care for widows and sick and the orphan should begin to say, whoa, where did everybody go? When the church begins doing what Jesus has called us to do, we should really take pressure off of these groups. You will find that often there are government programs, there are grassroots efforts, there are federally funded, locally funded, and just nonprofit groups often doing what we, the church, have been called to do and don't do. So no, I agree. Like, I get it. I get why Paul picks and chooses his battles. He's looking at the long term, but now we are in the long term. We are 2,000 years later. You and I have freedom. We can speak against our government freely. Paul couldn't. He did, and he gave his life. I have no fear tonight that any government official is going to end my life for preaching the gospel or addressing problems. As a matter of fact, I could get up here today and I could criticize the president, the governor, the mayor. I could say anything I want about them. We live in a very, very free country. But here's the deal. We have all these freedoms that they didn't have, and we don't use those freedoms to honor God in our lifestyle the way that Paul calls them to. So here's what I'm getting at. If Paul knows that the best way for them to change their city and change their culture and change their world and ultimately change human history is for them to live it out at home, maybe, just maybe, some of us should get our eyes off of what the government's doing. Look, I'm going to vote, I'm going to show up, I'm going to voice my concern, but I should not depend on the government to fix it. I should not place my hope in the school getting it right. I should not place my hope in this group over here getting it right because they have more funding. If we do what we're supposed to do, and last time I checked, more than half of this country claims Jesus. I know most don't follow Jesus, but more than half of this country claims to follow Jesus. If just a fraction of the Christians in this country, in this city, in this zip code, y'all, in 23704, if just a fraction of us would begin living this out at home in such a way that our neighbors don't just notice, they want a marriage like that. They want a relationship with their parents like that. They want a relationship with their grown children like that. They want a relationship with their neighbors, with the people who work for them, for the people they work for. They want that. And they are drawn and say, what is so different? And you don't throw a book of ideas at them. You don't give them some tips. You don't tell them some sap story about turning over a new leaf and hitting the gym more and feeling better about yourself. You say, Jesus has changed me, and he doesn't just change me on Sunday. He changes the way I treat my spouse. He changes the way I treat my parents. He changes the way I treat my kids. He changes the way I treat the garbage man. He changes the way I treat every human I come in contact with. And I have a love for you that I did not have before because I don't just see you as my neighbor who's always looking over the fence. I see you as a person created in the image of God. And when we begin to see people that way, it should influence the way we talk to them, talk about them, look at them, converse with them, pray for them. So I'll admit, there's a little bit of that social justice warrior in all of us that's like, Paul, go harder on slavery, right? Because we could not stand for this, but we forget that Paul knows who he's writing to, and most of them are slaves. And if he gets them riled up, they will die. If he tells them to walk out on their masters, they will be picked up by somebody probably worse. And so he does what he can to influence them to do what's right, and he knows that this can lead to life change, not just in their life, but in their masters, their fellow bondservants. And I will say it this way. The early church was built not by the powerful, the wealthy, the elite. It was often bondservants, slaves, and women. The most forgotten, overlooked, and underprivileged people groups you could imagine. You know, our problem isn't that we don't have the resources. It's not that we don't have the power. It's not that we don't have the tools. Our problem is we just don't want to. If I could be completely honest. We look at Christian living and we say it's too much, it's too hard, it's too far. I don't want that. And it frustrates me because we treat it as if it's just some nice little addition. Like as if tomorrow I started living out these Christian values, I'd just feel better. And what Paul knows is that if we actually start doing this, it can affect real change in our society, our community, in our world. It's not just about you. I want you to hear me say this. Husband, you should do this because it's right, but you should also do this for your kids' sake. You should do this because it's right, but you should also do this for your wife's sake. You should do this because it's right, but you should also do this for your neighbor's sake, for your church's sake, for your community's sake. For Jesus' sake, we should be living this out. Wives, children, single men, single ladies, our homes are not just refuges from which to run from the world. They are actually beacons, cities set on a hill. I would remind you that most of the churches, including the one Paul's writing to, met in, you guessed it, homes. So the church could not afford for there to be dysfunctional homes running around inside the church, inside a dysfunctional home. We do the gospel a great disservice when we invite people to church, witness, share the gospel, give our testimony, but have no order, no honor in our homes. Our homes should be places of order. And I do not mean an order that is always, I'm above, you're below, I make decisions. We've made clear that's not what submission is. That's certainly not what mutual submission is. It is also not a place of just rules. It's a place of order and honor. This new covenant that we spoke about earlier is so great because the Old Testament was full of order, and it certainly honored people. But in the New Testament, you find Jesus honoring people that even weren't honored in the Old Testament, right? The prostitutes, the people who sold their people out and were tax collectors. So when our homes operate as gospel-driven, salt and light, city on a hill, reflections of Jesus, I'm just going to tell you what happens. Your neighbors notice. Most of the marriages on your block are not doing that great. So when you have a God-honoring marriage and you respect your wife and you love your wife, other men will notice. Certainly their wives will notice, and they'll begin talking to your wife about what has she done, what has she figured out, how has she gotten her husband so in line, or they'll even come to you and say, what is so different about your wife? Why is she so much easier to love? Why is she so much easier to lead? And in those moments, we're tempted to say, well, I'm just such a good husband. I don't know. And my wife, she's just so great, We're just so good and you're not. It's tempting. But then we're reminded that's not the trick at all. It's not the key. It's Jesus. Because the best husband in this room has some moments when he don't look and act like Jesus. The best wife, the best grown child at home, the best child still living at home who's under the age of 18. All of us have moments we don't live up to that ideal image. But when we strive to live this out at home, it influences everyone and everything around us. So I'm going to close in a little bit different of a way. I'm going to go backwards. Because before we began reading verse 18 tonight, we read verse 17 on Sunday. And it's actually the framework for everything that Paul built to this point. And it's the framework that he's going to build off of, the foundation off of which he will jump into verse 18, where we started with wives, husbands, children, bondservants, fathers. And you know the verse well. Verse 17 says, whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Hey, what you're going to watch, can you watch that in the name of Jesus, or would he not want his name associated with that? The way you're about to talk to your spouse, could you do that in the name of Jesus, or is that something you'd not want him to be a part of? Hey, the conversation you're going to have later, like when your wife's asleep with that somebody at work, is that something you could do in the name of Jesus, or like not so much? Hey, the way you discipline your kids, is that something that would honor Jesus, or not so much? Hey, and then let's skip on to the next part, giving thanks. Are you giving thanks for your kids, or are you just like, God, why'd you give me these kids? Are you giving thanks for your spouse? Are you giving thanks for your home? Are you giving thanks for your parents? Or are you saying, God, why am I stuck with them? Because I'm going to be honest with you, when we do all that we do to the honor of God, do it in the name of the Lord Jesus and give thanks to God the Father through him, it begins to affect the way that we live. So my encouragement would be this, and just simply this. Tomorrow, when you get up, I would begin this prayer. God, help me to do everything I do at home today in a way that honors you, and help me to be thankful. And one of the ways we grow in thanksgiving is by saying, God, I am thankful for my spouse, and here's why. And if you can't come up with 10 things, you need to sit down until you can. God, thank you for my children, and here's 10 reasons why. And if you can't come up with 10 reasons you're grateful for your kids, you need to sit down until you can. God, I am grateful for my parents, and if you can't come up with 10 reasons why. I know not everybody knows their parents. I read an article this morning. In the United States, more grown children are estranged from their parents than ever before in American history. A lot of that is cultural. We live in a very independent culture. Immigrants who move to this country, they have an understanding that my parents raised me and I'm going to care for my parents when they age. That's not an American value anymore. So I will say this again. We can let culture frame our thinking and our eyes, or we can let Scripture inform how we're to honor our parents, even in their old age, their crankiness, their mean-spiritedness. And start tomorrow by saying, God, I'm grateful, and I'm going to honor you today in how I speak and how I treat people. Give me opportunities to be salt and light in my home so that we could be a beacon of light, of hope, a city set on a hill. I'll ask it one last time. Is your home a place that honors God and honors people and is ordered in such a way that there is love, joy, peace, patience, right? Abounding, overflowing out the doors in such a way that your neighbors would want to follow Jesus if they found out you were a follower of Christ? Or not so much? And if not, how can we begin tomorrow?